Welcome to Power BI and More with Ulrik Carlsson, the CRM chart guy from CRM Audio. This episode of Power BI and More is sponsored by Maplytics by Inogic. Maplytics by Inogic is a market-leading certified for Microsoft Dynamics 365 geo-analytical mapping app. Maplytics empowers users with powerful map visualizations and routing capabilities within Dynamics 3 CRM to drive better sales, improve business processes, and engage right customers at the right time. Maplytics now works with Dynamics 365 version 9 and Dynamics 365 app for mobile and tablet. Inogic is the leading Microsoft Gold Dynamics CRM ISV, delivering best-in-class Dynamics 365 solutions as well as cost-effective and high-quality programming services. We thank Maplytics by Inogic for sponsoring Power BI and More with Ulrik Carlsson.
Welcome to another episode of Power BI and More, the Dynamics 365 podcast on the CRM Audio Network that talks all about Power BI. And you're probably wondering, where's Joel? Well, I sent him off on assignment, and I'm doing my own personal tour of the CRM Audio Network, trying to get on as many shows as possible this week. I am Shawn Tabor. You probably have heard me on the CRM Audio podcast as well as at your service. And I'm very happy to be joining Ulrik on this little adventure to talk a little data export service. Now, Ulrik, let me ask you a question. Don't we already have an episode in the feed about data export service?
So we do. Yeah, Scott and Joel talked about it, but that episode is about a year old when the data export service was brand new. And so we want to look at a little bit more about that rather than the setup of the data export service, but what happens now that we have the data in it? What are some of the benefits of using it? Okay. And I actually got a good question recently. I was a part of the Extreme 365 conference here a couple of weeks ago in Dubrovnik. I got a good question from one of the attendees who, after going through all the different methods of how we can work with Dynamics 365 data in Power BI, we looked through doing like the direct options with the O data. We looked at the benefits of using fetch XML instead and some of the speed performance and improvements doing that. And we also looked at the data export service and saw some of the benefits that we could use or got from using that service. And the question was basically, is there any reason that we should not always be using the data export service? And for some reason, that question kind of stumped me because as a consultant, we like to, especially when we teach other consultants, like to focus on what are the different methods where we can do something, what are the pros and cons, what are the trade-offs, what you need to take into consideration when you define what method you're going to be using. Right. But kind of after going through it myself, it's like, well, is there really any reason we should not be using it? So I figured it would probably be a good time to like recap and see what is it that we get, what gets easier, what gets more complicated by using the data export service.
Well, and I think that really speaks to where we are now with the platform, right? A year ago is almost like light years away, realistically, in the way that the Dynamics 365 platform has evolved, right? And having something like the data export service a year ago was incredible, but now it has such utility that kind of question can come up and be taken quite seriously, right?
And from a year ago, that's about 2 iterations of Dynamics 365. But for Power BI, that's 12 iterations ago as they updated every single month.
That is insane.
So yeah, it's definitely hard to keep up with all the updates.
Whew. Wow. So let's start. For those who maybe haven't started at the beginning of the feed, right? Maybe they haven't heard that previous episode talking about the data export service. Why don't we start out talking about what it is? What is the data export service?
Yes. So the data export service itself is actually something that runs in the background. You don't really see it. And all it does is that it copies select entities from Dynamics 365 onto an Azure SQL database. So you basically have a SQL database in Azure that you can access with all your Dynamics 365 data, and it's all up to date. And what happens in the background is that it's actually using the change tracking feature on all the entities to continually update all your changes into the Azure SQL database. So for the entities that you've selected, and that's all the system entities, they are automatically enabled for change tracking. And any of the custom entities, you just check the box when you create the entity that says enable for change tracking, can be used by the data export service. And when it comes to the performance of it, Microsoft actually doesn't promise you anything about how fast that data will get updated. So if you make an opportunity, then the change tracking feature and the data export will be enabled, and they'll make the update on the corresponding record in the Azure SQL database. Now, Microsoft internally has a target and SLA for 15 minutes. They don't promise that to anyone anywhere via any contracts, but they have an internal target for 15 minutes. However, I heard recently here at the conference in Dubrovnik from Microsoft that 98% of all updates happens within 2 to 3 minutes. And in my experience and the situation I've been working with, and I've been demoing this quite a bit, that's actually usually happens a bit faster in my case, usually actually a little bit less than a minute from making changes inside Dynamics 365 to actually having those changes replicated onto the Azure SQL database.
And really, for most people's use of the data export service, that time frame, even 15 minutes, should be more than enough. Because I haven't run into a situation, anyways, in my experience, where you're trying to hit that Azure SQL replicated database in real time.
Right. Or at least not within the necessarily a 15-minute window or 2 to 3 minute window. We are getting pretty close to, I think Microsoft is calling it like near real time. It's not real time, but it's kind of near real time.
Okay.
So eventually, but this is usually seen in context of, say, Power BI, for example, where you connect and update the data, and it's refreshed once an hour, which may be not often enough. The frequency is not high enough on Power BI itself in some situations.
For a high transaction instance, I could see where you'd want to have that a little faster, but for most implementations, that should be sufficient, I would think.
Right. And getting the data exporter service set up is, depending on how you do it, actually can be fairly simple. If you go to powerbi.com, there's actually a menu item called Solution Templates, and one of them is called something like Dynamics 365 for Sales, and you can click on that, and it will actually go through every step and do the setup for you, and that includes logging into Dynamics 365, logging into Azure, creating a SQL server, creating the SQL database, creating the key vault. That's probably the most tricky part of this whole setup, that if you do this manually step by step, you actually have to install PowerShell and have the Azure commandlets and generate that key vault so you can set it up. That the solution template takes care of all of that for you. And you can go back, once that setup has been done, this takes about 10 to 15 minutes, the whole process. Once that process is done, you can actually go back into Dynamics 365 and install the data export service solution from AppSource. So notice the data export service and the data export service solution that you can install at AppSource is actually two different things. The one that you can install from AppSource into Dynamics 365 is actually just an interface where you can see what's going on with the data export service, and gives you updates on, when was the entities last synchronized, are there any failures, and also gives you an interface where you can basically just click on, there's a button in there called Manage Entities. You click on it and say, hey, I forgot to include cases. So you check off the case entity or the team entity, whichever entity that you want replicated onto your SQL database. Check them off, click OK, and the export service will basically start creating those tables and transferring the data, and that includes all the metadata, which is nice because if you go back and add some fields to your account or any of the other entities, those fields will automatically be created in the tables in your SQL database. So there's no additional work in trying to keep the tables of the metadata updated outside of specifying what entities you want to include.
That's cool. I did not realize that the solution template does so much on the back end, avoiding the whole PowerShell and the Power and applets, and that's fantastic. That
Right.
really expands the audience of who can actually set up data export service. Because if you don't know PowerShell, I mean, there's instructions that you could follow, sure, but I think that's great.
True. And if you haven't played with PowerShell and the Azure commandlets and so on and before, it can be pretty tedious to get started with. So I really recommend trying out the solution template. And since you can go back and make updates, add more entities afterwards, there's really no reason you shouldn't try it out. And the only item here that actually costs money, because everything does come at a cost, right? The data export service itself is included with your Dynamics 365 license, but you will have to pay for the Azure consumption of the database and the SQL Server, which can range anywhere from $5 a month to however much you want to pay for it, depending on storage and speed and performance, etc.
And I would imagine if you have a relatively small CRM database, obviously that's going to help lower the costs, but is it more storage that's the cost, or is it the speed and performance?
That's a good question, and it can be either.
Okay.
So if you look at some of the benefits for using the data export service, one of the primary benefits is definitely speed and performance.
Okay.
In particular, when you as the business analyst connect Power BI to your source, connecting to that Azure SQL database instead of Dynamics 365 directly, and we covered all the different methods of how you can do that in a previous episode, and we talk about which one were faster than the other. Using Fetch XML tends to be the fastest, connecting directly, actually significantly faster than the standard method using the standard connector. Even the faster method there is still slower than the cheapest database that you can get on Azure SQL. So you get a significant speed improvement in terms of retrieving data and getting your data into your Power BI model and can working with your data. And that's one of those areas that, as a business analyst, can be tedious to work with. Like you sit there and you wait, 30 seconds, 40 seconds to see all the tables or however much time it is. It feels like a really long time. Just connecting directly to the database significantly speeds up all of that. And that's even starting with the cheapest database. You can actually feel a significant improvement on speed and performance. So the other question is how, outside of that, how important is speed really in terms of loading all the data?
Okay.
It's not really all that important, because once you've done your data model, set up Power BI, and it refreshes in the background, it doesn't really matter if it takes 2 minutes or 10 minutes.
Right.
I mean, that all happens in the background. So you can actually, if required, you can scale your SQL database in Azure. You can scale it up and down the need and say, yeah, you do need to do a lot of work today in the database. You can actually scale it up for the day and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to double the performance for today, and then just scale it back down at the end of the day. Obviously, depending on who else is using at the time, because as you're scaling it up and down, there's going to be a few minutes or 5-10 minutes where the database might not be accessible. But otherwise, you can, of course, do that as needed, particularly when you're creating all these data models, connecting Power BI. Once everything's set up, you can scale it down to a more reasonable level if the cost of the database is an issue. But we're still talking, even some of the data I work with, I mean, we're still talking less than $100 a month. And you can probably also run these for like $30 or $50 a month, depending on how much space you actually needed, because the data doesn't really take up that much storage in the database itself.
So it's a very reasonable number, cost-wise, to have this kind of flexibility and this kind of utility for your data.
Yeah. That's for the database, not per user per month, anything like that. That's just for the database, and everybody can access it.
Right. And is there any difference in, this may be a silly question, but humor me. From a Power BI perspective, the licensing for Power BI is not impacted if your source of data is an Azure SQL replicated database from the data export service. Is that true or no?
That is a very good question. As always with license answers, you definitely want to check it up with your local Microsoft license expert.
Yep.
But in general, it depends on how you use the data.
Okay.
Because in this case, the SQL database is basically replicated data from Dynamics 365 and it's updated live or near real time, which means that whoever is accessing it and querying the data will need at least a team member license for Dynamics 365.
Okay.
And that's assuming that they're only using Power BI and it's not connecting to it in any other way, but they're just connecting and reading the data and reporting off of it. So they'll need at least a team member license.
Okay.
If, say, I do that and I create a Power BI report and I schedule it for hourly refreshes or daily refreshes and I share it with you, that means I will need, of course, a team member license to access the data and report off the data. I will need a Power BI Pro license because I'm also sharing that data with other users. Mm-hmm. You, however, if you don't touch Dynamics 365 at all, you just look at the report I made, mm-hmm. you won't need a license because you are not refreshing any data. If I gave you a report and you had the ability to refresh data, you would also need at least a team member license.
So if I exported that, let's say I exported that report to Excel and then tried to refresh from CRM, that's when I would need the team member license.
Right, because you are refreshing the data.
Right, I'm actively interacting with the data.
Exactly, and that's the switch on when you will need a license for Dynamics 365 or having the Power BI Pro license, for example, by itself is sufficient.
Okay, and I think I remember from last year's episode, they talked a little bit about security and how in this replication from the data export service, that business layer of security is removed. Is that still the case?
That is still the case. However, that happens as soon as you take the information into Power BI anyway. You're kind of adding a little bit to the mix here because now you have a SQL database in Azure with all your data, including fields that may have field security. That'll be there too. Mm-hmm. So you want to take that into account. That's also going to happen if you take the information into Power BI. So if your system administrator creates a report in Power BI and shares those reports, then everybody automatically have access to all of that data. The same thing with the Azure SQL database. You take all the information out and you give somebody access to it. They can see everything unless you do something to scale it down. Now, specifically on security, since we actually have we remove basically now 2 steps removed right from the security layer from Dynamics 365 and Power BI, you can still use some of the security practices that Joe and I talked about on the previous episode, where you can actually pull in, and this goes for the data export service too, you can pull information about the privileges, the roles, and what users has what role and what privileges for what entity, and apply role level security inside Power BI to make sure that people only have access to records that they either own or records that are in their business unit or in their hierarchy, for example. So that's still an option with the data export service.
Okay. Another option I would imagine is you just blow them out. Any ones with field level security.
Right.
Can you do that as well once it's replicated to Azure SQL?
Right. You can do that on the database level, or you can do that within the Power BI data model too.
Okay.
So it really depends on where you give people access for whom security needs to be applied. Because you can do it at the database level on the SQL database, and basically just clean out the data from the fields that have field security. But also when you connect Power BI, you can basically remove those fields from your Power BI data model, so anyone you share it with basically won't have access to them. They won't exist in the model even.
Okay. And are there any other significant differences in how the data is structured once it's replicated to Azure SQL?
All right, yeah. So we're mentioning some of the trade-offs because we're talking a lot about the additional performance you get, and that's great. But yeah, we have the security layer there, and of course we need the additional database. Another thing is that the tables in the database, in the SQL database, are not related in the same way that they are in Dynamics 365. They're basically standalone tables with data. So when we use a standard connector, for example, of fetch.xml, connect directly to Dynamics 365, and we have the contact entity and we have the parent account, we can actually click that little parent. There's a little expand button on top of the parent account relationship, where we can say, hey, let's bring in the name of the account, and you can very easily switch out the name and add the name in the data model using those relationships. You cannot do that in the SQL database. And I should actually just mention in saying that you can use those relationships. That used to be a big no-no. Had we had this conversation, let's say a year ago, in Power BI, I would have said never ever touch those expandable fields. They slow down everything so significantly, etc. If you have a few in there now, and the ones that you need, the ones that make sense, and get rid of all the other ones, they actually don't slow you down that much any longer. The data retrieval and the unfolding of the data and the querying has improved significantly since we had that conversation, if we had the conversation a year ago. So I would say in certain instances now they can actually be very helpful, but it's something that you want to use with care. You don't want to necessarily use it for everything.
So now with the Azure SQL replicated database, are you essentially falling back to T-SQL to do joins and that kind of thing to get the data how you need it?
Right. You can use the Power BI query editor for that. So you can retrieve all the data, create the relationships, and basically manipulate the data any way you need it. Create relationships that may not even exist inside Dynamics 365. So you have a lot of flexibility. The challenge is it's not done for you, or at least you don't have the built-in relationships. You can't take advantage of those out of the box.
Okay, but if you have someone in your IT organization who maybe isn't familiar with Power BI but is with T-SQL, could they, and they have access to the Azure account, I would assume, would they be able to use those kind of tools, the standard SSIS tools, to manipulate the data in the Azure SQL?
Absolutely. And they will also be able to create new views in the database that you can take advantage of in Power BI too. So you can have specific filtered views that only have certain columns or fields in them. And that's actually one of the big benefits of the data export service, outside of all the ones that we're talking about now, is that it also enables you to do SQL reporting on Dynamics 365 Online, which has been a big challenge for some organizations. Sometimes some organizations have actually been very reluctant to upgrade to Dynamics 365 Online from on-premise, exclusive of the reason say, hey, we have hundreds of SQL reports lying around. We are not going to redo everything with that weird fetch XMLs and all its limitations, etc. Which I can see if you're coming from the SQL world, I can definitely understand those. I kind of got brought into it with fetch XML first, so I'm not as opposed to it as other people are. But I can definitely see where all those arguments are coming from. And now there's really no argument to say you shouldn't do it, because we have all the tools now, and you can do that SQL reporting off your data, and it's going to be near real-time data of Dynamics 365.
That is very cool. I have another question. This might be a difficult one to answer, but it came top of mind because I had a client actually not 6 months ago that wanted to do this, and they're on-prem, but they want to move to the cloud, right? They haven't yet. Would this give them the ability to take this Azure SQL database and copy it locally so that they could essentially have a backup to just allay any kind of data fears that they have with the cloud?
So they should be able to move the data, and what they can do, if you look at the solution templates too, there's actually also a version when you set up the solution template is not to use the data export service, but if you have an on-premise Dynamics 365 instance, you can actually, and I believe they're using Scribe Online, copy all the data in a similar manner to the SQL database. So you can actually get all the information into the SQL database.
So would that essentially be using the dual use license where you could have cloud and on-prem at the same time? But then you would have to stand up that infrastructure for on-prem, wouldn't you? It wouldn't be just the database. It would have to be a CRM server, I would assume.
Right. Oh, so you wanted to have both CRM on-premise?
Well, what I'm saying is they want to move to the cloud. So could we have a cloud instance, but then just take the copy of the SQL data and bring it down to the ground on a SQL server?
Oh, so you wanted to have an on-premise SQL server with your
right
Dynamics 365 online?
Yeah.
You can do that, and actually, I believe the solution template probably lets you set up that too using Scribe. However, the data export service will not let you do that. The data export service is only from online to Azure to online.
Okay, cool.
But Microsoft is using Scribe as a partner in those instances to help set up those solution templates.
And you would still need to purchase Scribe Online licensing to do that. Just because it's a partnership doesn't mean that comes free.
Right. I think you get a little bit of time for free when you set up those templates. But then, yes, the clock will start ticking at some point, and then you'll have to pay for it.
Okay. Very cool. So what other trade-offs do we have with the data export service?
Right, so we can't get through talking about Power BI and Dynamics 365 together without also talking about option sets and their values and labels not being included as part of the data model. And the data export service is no exception. Okay. So we still only get the values. We don't have the labels on there. You can actually use if you can build views in the SQL database that maps those option set values with the correct labels. So obviously a multi-language situation in that you may have to take into account if you have that type of environment. But what's interesting is that the data export service actually gives you a couple of tables with all the option set values for all languages. It's called option set metadata. That table you don't have access to inside Dynamics 365. It's actually built here as a part of the process of setting it up. So you can actually get all those parameters that you need in order to basically switch out those values with the correct labels, and it includes the language code. So you can even do some tricky lookup formulas that may be even using the current user's language codes, etc. So you actually get access to all of that, and that includes custom option sets, not just the global ones. Those you can access normally, but all the custom ones, you basically get one big table with all those values. So your formulas for switching out the data gets a little more complex because you need to include the entity name and the option set name and the language code, etc. But you have all the information there in order to create it.
So now, do you have to have the language pack installed before you run the first time sync, and then that's where it's deriving which languages to include in that, or is it going across all languages that Dynamics 365 supports?
It is going across all the languages that are installed.
Wow. Okay.
So if you only have English in there, then you only see English. If you go ahead and add Danish and Chinese, which I did just to test it out, then Danish and Chinese starts appearing in the table. So that gets updated automatically. So if you add a new language, they'll be included.
Very cool.
And you get some more fun with some of those tables. Some metadata about all the relationships between the entities that you have included that you can use in Power BI with some of the network visualizations. So you can basically create a data map in Power BI and play around with it, and it looks pretty cool. I don't think it's very useful, but it looks pretty cool. So you get some more information in there about the metadata. The only thing you don't get, which might be a little frustrating, is you don't get the display names of the individual fields. You get the schema names and all that stuff, but the display names are still missing. We still have to replace those.
And have you put anything on ideas to get them to add those?
So you know what, I should add that to the ideas page.
If you do that, we'll put a link to those idea posts in the show notes so our listeners can upload those.
Sounds good. Well, I'll put the pressure on. I guess I have to do it now.
See, there you go. That's what I do.
I know you have to promise something publicly, and then you automatically will have to get it done.
That's right. That's the difference between me and Joel. I'm a man of action. Joel's very laid back. I'm like, let's go. Let's talk a little bit. I don't know a lot about this topic, but I know that it was part of the data export service and some of the benefits. But let's talk a little bit about direct querying.
Yes. So kind of the last main benefit of using the data export service and the Azure SQL database is that you can use direct query in Power BI to get access to your data. And to explain direct query is probably to say normally when you use Power BI, and the way you have to use it when connecting to Dynamics 365 directly is that you import all the data into Power BI, you work with your data model, and then you present your reports, and people can interact with those reports. If you set up a direct query report instead, you're actually not importing any data into Power BI. Power BI only holds a little bit of information about the data model and the reports that you have, but it's actually going to directly query the data in the database whenever you look at the report. Okay. So you can basically hit refresh at any time, and you can see the most up-to-date version. So if you use a direct query report on the Azure SQL database, that basically means that you are looking at Dynamics 365 data in a Power BI format that can, with almost all the powers that Power BI gives you, look at close to or near real-time data. So whenever you go update, say opportunities, etc., new values, you go look at the sales leaderboard, you want to see a new position in the Power BI report, you can actually have some visualizations that uses direct querying instead. And you don't have to wait an hour or 2 hours or a day until Power BI refreshes the data set. It'll basically just query the SQL database directly and show you the information. So you can actually get significantly reduce the amount of time from making changes in Dynamics 365 to see the results in Power BI. But there is a few limitations to that. There's some great benefits to it, but you have to use it carefully. You should only use that if you want to basically scale down on the time and get that near real-time data, because you cannot mix tables from different databases. So everything has to come from the same database. So you can't just point to SQL and then some other databases and mix that data. There are also some limitations on the kind of queries that you can do. They cannot be too complex. You cannot create new columns in Power BI. Everything has to come straight from the data source. Usually that's also sufficient. But you can still build your relationships in the data. There's also some time intelligence features that are not available. But a lot of the standard DAX expressions are allowed. However, if you get very, very complex DAX expressions, some of them are not allowed. But you can override those. As an admin, you can go in and override those DAX expressions. That's where you create all the formulas for, sum of estimated revenue and your opportunities, etc. And the row-level security can also impact the performance quite a bit here using this type of querying. So you want to use it for select items. So you have a single report that says these specific visuals we want to have as close to real time as possible, and then you can show those, add those to a dashboard. Because you can, on your dashboard in Power BI, you can mix from different reports. So you can actually have some that are, refreshed hourly with some very advanced KPIs, and then you can have your stuff that's being updated close to real time in a dashboard by itself. So on the dashboard, you can actually start mixing these different visuals, but in your report itself, everything has to come from that same database. So you can actually get pretty close to the whole near real-time Power BI situation using the SQL database, which is interesting because we're going like this long way around, right? From taking Dynamics 365 data, replicating it over to an Azure SQL, then connecting it via Power BI and displaying it on some nice visuals, probably even back inside Dynamics 365, right? And that's the way we can get the best performance out of it.
And even if you extrapolate that out even once more, you basically put your data in the cloud, send it somewhere else in the cloud, then use another tool that's in the cloud to grab that data. It's all in the same cloud, which is kind of crazy. But it's light years ahead of where we were just even a year ago.
Right. And it's fun because when I do this demo here, I've been doing it at some conferences recently, and one of my kind of my tricks that I have is that I have a dashboard with all these Power BI visuals. One of them is like the standard connection. One of them is the direct connection. One other one is the Azure SQL database. So I have like these 4 different visuals, and then I go change some of the opportunities, and I come back to the dashboards, and we see how quickly they actually update. And we can actually see the direct query run updates usually within a minute.
Wow.
So I kind of generally feel it out, like how I want to present it. Do I want to like take the long way around and look at the data export service and see the synchronization update before I go back and look at it? But now I just go to the dashboard and we look at it, and usually it shows up within like 30 seconds to a minute. So I kind of just talk to all the stuff that's happening in the background. But the trick that I was mentioning was that I also have another Power BI chart in there that looks just like all the other Power BI charts that updates immediately. And you can click on it, and you can actually do immediate drill downs to the records and click on them. And that's actually just a regular chart that I put in there that I just styled completely to look like one of the Power BI charts.
That's very cool.
And then kind of like, trigger, does anybody know how I added this Power BI chart in there? So you're like, no, I haven't seen that before. I was like, oh, it's just a regular chart that I made to look like a Power BI chart. Because, of course, I had to say something about, the regular charts are not dead. They actually still have a situation where you still get a better performance out of them depending on the situation that you're doing.
Right.
But of course, with the direct querying, we can aggregate a lot more data than we ever would be able to with the regular charts. And you can actually even query more data through the direct querying than you can by importing the data. So that you actually expand the options that you can do. So all the pieces that we have to make the best dashboards are just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Or are we getting more and more pieces in order to put all of this together?
That is very cool. I'm very happy that I got to I guess fill in for Joel, because I've learned a lot just in this 35 or so minutes. And I have a confession. Power BI scares the hell out of me. I'm just going to put that out there. I don't know why, but at the last Extreme 365, when it was in Long Beach, in California, and we were doing the app challenge, right?
Right.
There was a part where we had to do something in Power BI, and Sarah Jelinek and I were sitting next to each other, and we're like, okay, who's going to do it? And I'm like, I can't do it. I'll do it wrong. I can't do it. I can't do it. She goes, okay, well, I don't know it either. And she just started doing it, looking at your blog posts, and she just followed your blog posts, and she did it. And I was just amazed. And there was one time we had to call you over to help, but you were there, so why not?
That's awesome.
But she was able to do it, and it made me both jealous and angry. I'm like, damn it, I can do it. But yeah, I appreciate all that you're putting out there with the content, because it does make a big difference. And this was great. I enjoyed talking about this. I didn't.
And I can say your experience is very similar to mine when I started working with Power BI. I thought it was very overwhelming, and I think my biggest challenge was, once we have the correct data model in Power BI, it's super easy, and you get all these great visuals. But creating that data model and making that easy to use is the difficult part. So if anyone, and that's actually why we talk so much about it on the show. Like, why do we keep talking about all these data models and retrieval methods, and how do we do that and stuff? And that's because that's where you basically create the model for other people, to make it easy for other people to consume all of those reports and create those great reports.
Right.
So that one can be a bit of a hurdle to get over. Obviously, I had some benefits in working with charts a lot, so I had some intricate knowledge of the Dynamics 365 data model that I could apply to working with the same model in Power BI. So that was definitely helpful.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I would like to, publicly on this podcast, invite you to come on to At Your Service to talk about the field service solution template for Power BI, because I think that would be a great conversation for our audience as well. You kind of like bring the two worlds together. And maybe at some point after that conversation, maybe I'll actually try to build something in Power BI.
All right. And I'll have to take a closer look at that field service template now.
See what I do?
Yep.
It's what I do.
Awesome.
It's a gift. But any last words on the data export service or any other information you want to provide to our audience before we sign off?
No, I'll say try it. If you haven't tried it out yet, try it out. Try and connect Power BI to it and see how it flows. And it might be right for you. It probably is. If you're working a lot with connecting to Dynamics 365, check it out. And also, if you have high volumes of records, you may even get much better performance in the long run by using this as opposed to connecting to Dynamics 365 directly. So try it out. Use the solution templates. It's easy. It's free to get started if you have an Azure trial, so there's really no excuse you shouldn't.
This has been Power BI and More with Ulrik Carlsson and Joel Lindstrom. You can follow Ulrik and his blog, crmchartguy.com, or follow him at Twitter at crmchartguy. This episode is a production of Dynamics Podcast LLC.